I never thought it would end like this. Me standing in front of the people I once called family, my hands trembling as I reached for the envelope. But they only saw the tremor, not the truth, not the fire that lived behind my weathered fingers, just the shake, and they laughed. "My God, look at her," Diane muttered, loud enough for the front row to hear. Maybe she shouldn't be handling anything that important at her age. The chuckle that followed was sharp, like broken glass sliding under skin. My nephew Ethan snorted beside her and whispered, maybe she signed something she didn't even mean to. They thought I didn't hear. They thought I was too old, too slow, too soft. I heard every word. "My name is Eleanor May Carter, and I'm 71 years old. I've worked every day of my life since I was 17, taught high school English, raised 3 sons, buried 1 husband, survived 2 heart surgeries, and cared for my sister until cancer stole what dementia hadn't. But today, at my late brother Harold's will reading, none of that seemed to matter, because today, all they saw was my shake. Let me tell you something. The hands may shake, but the mind, it's still sharp. Sharp enough to remember every smirk, every slight, every conversation behind closed doors that they didn't know I overheard. I've spent the past 10 months pretending I didn't see their betrayal, pretending I didn't notice the way they hovered over Harold's signature pages, pretending I didn't know what they were planning, but I knew, and I had time. It all began the night Harold called me. It was a cold evening in February, cold enough that my joints ached before I even picked up the phone. "Ellie," he said, "can you come over? I don't know what's wrong with me, but I need you." When I arrived, Harold looked thinner than I remembered. His hands trembled too, but no one mocked him for that. They only ever mock old women, don't they? He told me he'd been thinking about his estate, that he wanted to revise his will, again, that he didn't trust Diane, his daughter-in-law, and that he hadn't heard from his own son, Ethan's father, in months. "They just want the money," he whispered, voice breaking. "They think I'm too old to know the difference, but I do." That was the last real conversation we had. 2 weeks later, he was gone. And just like that, they circled like vultures. Diane moved into the house within days, said she was managing his affairs. Ethan showed up the next morning claiming he'd always been close to Grandpa. Suddenly, family members who hadn't spoken to Harold in years were popping out of the woodwork like cockroaches after a storm. And the will? The one I watched Harold revise just days before he died? Nowhere to be found. Until today. We were in the downtown courthouse, a grand building with tall gray walls and ceilings that echoed every footstep. The lawyer, Mr. Lanham, stood at the head of the table with a sealed envelope, his eyes scanning the room cautiously. He looked uncomfortable, nervous even. I could tell he was holding something back. "Before I begin," he said, adjusting his glasses, "I want to confirm that everyone present understands that the version of the will I am about to read is dated January 9th. I froze. That wasn't the most recent version. I knew because I was there when Harold signed the last one, on February 1st, 3 days before he passed. Diane cleared her throat. "Of course we understand. January 9th was his final version. Right, Eleanor?" She smiled at me sweetly, as if she hadn't just gutted me in front of everyone. Her eyes were daring me to speak. I stared back at her. My hands shook. Yes, but not from fear, not from frailty, from restraint, because I knew what was in my bag, not a tissue, not a Bible, the updated copy. They thought they'd won, that their version, manipulated, backdated, forged, would stand unchallenged, that the woman with trembling hands and a cardigan too big for her frame wouldn't dare question them. But they forgot who they were dealing with. I wasn't just Harold's sister. I was his witness, and I had something they didn't, the truth. So when the laughter came and the whispers snaked their way through the courtroom like poison, I waited until Lanham cleared his throat again, waited until the silence settled over the room like dust, and then I stood up. "My apologies," I said softly, reaching into my bag, "but I believe the court will want to see this version of my brother's will." You could have heard a pin drop, and I wasn't shaking anymore. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, like it carried the weight of every sleepless night I'd spent debating whether or not to speak up. I placed it gently on the table in front of Mr. Lanham, whose face paled the moment he saw the familiar handwriting across the flap. Harold M. Carter, last will and testament, February 1st. Diane's voice broke the silence, shrill and immediate. "What is that?" she asked, rising halfway from her chair, her manicured fingers gripping the edge of the polished mahogany table. "That's not... Harold never... What is she doing?" Mr. Lanham didn't answer her. Instead, he looked at me. "Ms. Carter, may I ask where this came from?" "From Harold," I said. "He signed it at his home with me and his neighbor, Lyle Benson, as witnesses. The notary came that same evening. You can call him. He remembers." Behind me, I heard a scoff. Ethan leaned forward, his smug expression faltering. "This is absurd. You expect us to believe you're just walking in here with a brand new will? After all this time?" "I'm not expecting you to believe anything," I replied calmly. "I'm expecting the court to verify it. That's what this process is for." Mr. Lanham opened the envelope carefully. I noticed the way his hands trembled slightly, too. Something about that gave me the courage to keep standing. He pulled out the document, his brow furrowing deeper as he read. His lips moved slightly, quietly mouthing the date, the clause, the signature. And then his eyes widened. "This version is substantially different," he said. No one in the room breathed. Diane's voice dropped a few octaves. "Different how?" Mr. Lanham swallowed hard. "In this version, the primary beneficiary is Eleanor." The silence shattered into chaos. "You lying old witch!" Diane shouted, lunging across the table before her husband yanked her back by the elbow. "You manipulated him. You waited until he was weak and confused, and this is elder abuse. This is fraud." "You'd know a lot about that, wouldn't you?" I said, locking eyes with her. "Except Harold wasn't confused. He was disappointed. In you." Ethan stood too, pointing a trembling finger at me like he was still a boy being scolded by his teacher. "This isn't happening. This can't. My dad said everything was set. He said the lawyer already had it." And there it was, the slip I needed. I turned to Mr. Lanham. "You heard that?" He nodded slowly. Ethan realized too late what he'd admitted. Diane hissed under her breath. "Shut up, Ethan." But I wasn't done. I turned to the judge seated behind the bench, a woman with iron gray hair and eyes like chipped stone. "Your Honor," I said, voice steady, "this will was notarized and witnessed. I have copies of Harold's communications with me. I believe this is the document he intended as final." The judge nodded. "Then we will treat it as such until verified." Diane started to cry, big fake sobs that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. "She's lying. She had to coerce him. Harold never would have left me and Ethan out." I couldn't help it. I laughed. Not loud, just enough. "Diane," I said, "Harold caught you siphoning money from his account last December. Remember? You said it was an accident, that the shared grocery card had a glitch, but he saw the transfer, and the necklace, and the wine club." Her face went beet red. "He told me everything. He was going to confront you. But then he got sick, so he asked me to help him make sure everything went where it was supposed to go." I could see Ethan processing it all, the cracks in the perfect plan, the holes in their story, the fact that his own arrogance had helped me without even realizing it. "I should have been the one to help him," Ethan mumbled. "I'm family." "And where were you when he was alone in the hospital?" I shot back. "Where were you when he couldn't drive himself to chemo? Where were you when he fell twice in 1 week and all he wanted was someone to sit with him?" No answer, because they weren't there. I was. The judge leaned forward. I will have both versions reviewed by a forensic specialist, but if the signatures are legitimate, this courtroom will honor the most recent, legally binding version. That's the law. Diane collapsed into her seat like someone had cut her strings. Ethan just sat there, pale and quiet. I returned to my chair, ignoring the daggers in their glares. My hands were shaking again, but this time I wasn't afraid. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. Even after handing the will over, after watching Diane's fury melt into panicked sobbing and Ethan's disbelief solidify into stone-faced silence, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Not because I was afraid of what would happen next, but because I was remembering everything that led me to that moment. All the late nights, all the doubt, all the times I nearly convinced myself to just let it go. But Harold wouldn't have wanted that. He used to say, "Ellie, you've always been the quiet one, but when you stand up, you stand all the way up." And I had. Finally. Still, even courage needs reinforcement. The next morning, I met with Harold's neighbor, Lyle Benson, in a quiet coffee shop 2 blocks from the courthouse. He was already there when I arrived, early as always, sipping black coffee and scribbling in one of those tiny crossword books he kept in his glove compartment. "Didn't think I'd see you again so soon," he said, looking up with a smile. I slid into the booth across from him. "You were right. They tried to bury the new will." "Told you," he said with a small chuckle. "People get strange when money's involved. Harold knew it too. That's why he insisted we notarize it and make copies." I nodded. "I need your help again. They're going to fight it." Lyle's smile faded, replaced by that quiet, old man seriousness that I'd come to respect over the last few months. "You want me to testify?" "I may need it. You were there when Harold signed the new version. You heard what he said, how he wanted to change everything, how he didn't trust Diane." He set down his cup. "You still have the voice memo?" I pulled out my phone and tapped the file. It wasn't long, just 38 seconds, but Harold's voice came through clearly, wheezing between sentences. "Ellie, I want this one to count. They'll be mad, but you've been here. You showed up. You always do. Make sure they don't take what they don't deserve." Lyle listened silently. When the audio ended, he looked up at me and said, "He meant every word." The voice memo had been my lifeline for months. I hadn't even told Mr. Lanham about it yet. I wanted to wait until Diane and Ethan tried to challenge the handwriting or claim Harold was confused or worse, coached. That's what they were going to try. I could already hear the angle forming in their heads. She manipulated him. He wasn't in his right mind. Look at her. She's a bitter old woman who wanted revenge. But they underestimated me. Again. That afternoon, I went to the courthouse clerk's office and filed the memo as supplemental evidence. Along with it, I submitted Harold's hospital records from the day he signed the new will, confirming he was lucid, alert, and medically cleared for visitors. The notary's name was already in the will packet. I called him personally to ensure he'd confirm everything. He did. "Harold Carter?" the notary said over the phone. "Yes, I remember him. Frail but clear-headed. Seemed determined. Asked thoughtful questions. I even remember he joked about his funeral playlist." That was Harold. Diane and Ethan weren't going to win this time. 3 days later, the official notice came. The court was moving to validate the new will based on preliminary authentication. A full hearing would follow. Diane immediately filed an objection, claiming undue influence. But the moment she brought in her lawyer, a stiff man with a cheap tie and a tone like cold gravy, I could see her confidence was already beginning to crack. Their defense was built on one thing, that I was too old, too fragile, too emotional to be trusted. They harped on my hands, my age, my relationship with Harold. They made it sound like I had nothing else going on in my life, as if I had just waited like a spider in a web, hoping for inheritance. But they couldn't erase the paper trail. They couldn't silence the memo. They couldn't scrub the fact that I had not only stayed by Harold's side, but had witnessed and documented his wishes down to the dotted I. And still, even knowing all this, I was nervous walking into that courtroom again. The hearing room was packed. Diane wore black. How dramatic. Ethan looked like he hadn't slept. I walked in wearing a soft blue sweater Harold once gave me for Christmas. I didn't wear black. I didn't come to grieve. I came for justice. Mr. Lanham greeted me with a polite nod and leaned over. "We have everything. And the judge is thorough. Stay calm. They're going to attack your character. Let them try." And they did. Diane's attorney stood with his pointer finger wagging in the air like he was casting a spell. "Isn't it true, Ms. Carter, that you suffer from tremors and memory lapses?" "I suffer from arthritis and high blood pressure," I replied. "My memory is sharp. I remember every date, including the day Harold changed his will and the day Diane changed the locks before his body was even cold." The courtroom murmured. The judge raised an eyebrow. Mr. Lanham stood next, with the memo in hand and a printed copy of Harold's email to him, requesting a new will draft. The judge read every word. She asked every question. And then, near the end of the hearing, she looked directly at me and said, "Ms. Carter, your hands may tremble, but your documentation does not." That's when I knew the tide had turned. Diane didn't show up to the next court date. She claimed she was unwell, that the stress of the entire ordeal was affecting her mental health, but I knew better. She was unraveling. Her world, the one she'd tried to build on lies and greed, was crumbling around her brick by fraudulent brick, and I was the one holding the match. Ethan came alone. He didn't speak, didn't even make eye contact with me, just sat there, his shoulders hunched, his jaw tight. I almost felt sorry for him, almost. But then I remembered how he stood at that first reading, sneering, mocking me with his mother, how he laughed at my hands, how he looked at me like I was something beneath him. Number sympathy had no place here. The judge called for final statements that day. My lawyer, Mr. Lanham, stood with quiet confidence. He didn't need to shout or point fingers. He just laid it out plainly. The February will was legally sound. It had been witnessed, notarized, and filed appropriately. The memo from Harold proved intent. The email chain confirmed planning. The notary had provided a signed affidavit. And I had no criminal record, no financial stake until Harold made me executor, and a well-documented history of caregiving and presence in his final months. In contrast, Diane and Ethan had nothing but claims. When the judge asked Diane's lawyer for a rebuttal, he scrambled. He questioned my motives, my health, my character. Again, but this time his voice wavered. There was a desperation to it, because deep down, he knew it was over. And then something unexpected happened. The judge requested to hear the voice memo played aloud in court. I nodded and handed the bailiff my phone. He plugged it into the speaker system and tapped play. Harold's voice, raspy but clear, filled the room. "Ellie, I want this one to count. They'll be mad, but you've been here. You showed up. You always do. Make sure they don't take what they don't deserve." You could have heard a pin drop. Ethan blinked hard. Diane's lawyer sank slightly in his chair. Even the stenographer paused for a beat. The judge finally spoke. "I've heard enough. I will make my ruling tomorrow at noon." It was almost done. But the real twist? It hadn't even happened yet. That night, I received an email from a name I didn't expect. Kendra, Harold's old caregiver. She had left the state 3 months before he died, suddenly and without explanation. At the time, I found it odd, but grief had swallowed that suspicion whole. Her message read, "Ms. Carter, I've heard what's going on. I kept quiet because Diane threatened me. She said if I ever said a word about what I saw, she'd ruin me. But I can't stay silent anymore. I have copies of some documents Harold asked me to scan. One is a letter he wrote the day he changed his will. It's addressed to you. I'm sending it attached. Use it however you need. I hope it brings peace." I clicked the attachment with shaking hands, this time from emotion, not weakness. It was dated February 1st, the same day as the will. Dear Ellie, if you're reading this, it means I didn't get to say goodbye properly, but I want you to know, thank you. You were always there. I should have done this sooner. I just kept hoping they'd change, that Diane would stop treating me like a wallet, that Ethan would see me as more than an estate to inherit. But they didn't. You never asked for anything. You just showed up. You cooked when I couldn't lift a pan. You read to me when I couldn't keep my eyes open. You forgave me when I didn't deserve it. This house, this land, what's left of my savings, it should go to someone who cared, someone who remembered who I was before the cancer. That was you. If they fight this, don't back down. I know you're tired. I know your hands shake, but your spirit doesn't. With love, Harold. Tears blurred my vision. I read the letter twice, 3 times, printing it before forwarding a copy to Mr. Lanham with the subject line, "New evidence to present before ruling." By the time I lay down, I knew something had shifted. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about dignity, about loyalty, about truth rising no matter how deep someone tries to bury it. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed with anticipation. Diane was back, sunglasses on indoors, flanked by her lawyer and Ethan, who looked like he hadn't slept in days. I walked in alone. But I wasn't alone, not really. I had Harold's words, his trust, his will, and that was all I needed. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, breathing slowly through my nose, just like Harold had taught me when I used to panic during storms. In through the nose, hold it, out through the mouth, he'd whisper. Even thunder sounds smaller when you're calm. Well, the thunder in that courtroom was about to roar. The judge entered promptly at noon, her face unreadable. A hush fell across the room as she adjusted her robe and took her seat. She shuffled a few papers before speaking, not immediately addressing us, but reviewing her notes, as though deliberately building the tension. I watched Diane fidget beside her lawyer. Her glossy lips were pressed together so tightly they'd turned pale. Ethan wouldn't even look at me. I didn't need them to. After thorough review of the evidence presented by both parties, the judge began, including testimony, notarized documentation, audio recordings, and supplementary written materials filed late last evening. My heart quickened. She'd read the letter. It is the court's determination that the February 1st will submitted by Ms. Eleanor Carter is the valid and binding last will and testament of Harold M. Carter. I closed my eyes for a second, my fingers tightening into fists. Not in anger, in release. Gasps echoed around the courtroom. Diane shot to her feet. "This is insane! She manipulated him! This is a setup!" Her lawyer tugged her sleeve, whispering harshly, "Sit down. It's over." But Diane didn't sit. She pointed at me, her voice breaking. "She's lying. She had to. Why would Harold leave everything to her? She's nothing." The judge slammed her gavel. "Enough." The room stilled. "I will remind you, Mrs. Andrews," the judge said coldly, "that what matters in this courtroom is evidence, and the evidence overwhelmingly supports the validity of the February will. Your accusations, lacking any supporting facts or documentation, hold no weight." "But—" Diane started, but the judge raised her hand again. "I've also reviewed the attached letter from Mr. Carter," she continued, "and while it is not a legal instrument in itself, it provides compelling insight into his intentions. It confirms in his own handwriting that the changes made in the final version of the will were deliberate, not coerced." Diane finally dropped into her seat, visibly shaking now. The judge turned to me. "Ms. Carter, as executor, you may now begin proceedings to distribute the estate in accordance with this ruling. Any further contestation by other parties must follow the appeals process through appropriate channels." I nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." That was it. The bang of the gavel sealed everything. Harold's house, his land, his savings, the little collection of Civil War books he cherished, all of it, now mine to protect and honor. But more than that, his voice had been heard. his wishes upheld. I stood slowly, tucking the original letter into my coat pocket like a secret I could finally carry with pride. As I turned to leave, I caught Ethan's eyes. He didn't look angry. He didn't look smug or even bitter anymore. He looked small, defeated. He tried to mouth something. I'm not sure if it was sorry or help or why, but I didn't stop to find out, because Diane wasn't done yet. Just outside the courtroom, in the hallway near the elevators, she caught up to me. Her heels clicked like gunshots across the floor. "You think this makes you better than us?" she hissed. "You think he really wanted you to have it all? You're just an old woman who clung to a dying man." I turned slowly, finally meeting her without flinching. "No," I said. "I'm an old woman who showed up for him. And you showed up for his money." Her face twisted, but she had nothing left to say. I got in the elevator and pressed the button. As the doors closed, I saw her reflection in the polished steel. Frozen, helpless, exposed, and I felt no guilt. That evening, I walked through Harold's house alone. My house now. I touched the arm of his favorite recliner. I opened the fridge to see he still had my homemade peach jam tucked on the second shelf. I stood in the middle of the living room and just listened. It was quiet. But it wasn't lonely, because every corner of this home remembered me, and I finally felt at peace. The legacy wasn't about the money. It was about being seen, being chosen, being loved enough to be trusted with the pieces of a life that truly mattered. And the people who mocked my shaky hands, they forgot something important. It's not how steady your fingers are. It's how strong your spine is when the moment calls for it. Weeks passed. I didn't make any big announcements. No bold Facebook posts, no dramatic declarations to the neighbors. I didn't need to. Word spread on its own. People in town started greeting me differently. The pharmacist called me Miss Carter now instead of ma'am. The clerk at the post office offered to carry my packages without being asked. A woman I hadn't spoken to in years stopped me outside the market to say, "You handled that whole thing with such grace." But it wasn't grace. It was grief and grit. Grief for the brother I'd lost, who had never quite known how to express love until the end, and grit for the woman I had to become, to honor him after everyone else tried to rewrite his last words. The first thing I did was walk through Harold's house with a yellow notepad. Not to list valuables, not to figure out what I could sell, but to write down every memory. The sunken spot on the couch where he used to fall asleep during football games, the dent in the wooden floor from the time we danced barefoot like fools after his 60th birthday, the garden outside, wild with neglect, where he once planted tomatoes and basil just to impress a woman he never called back. I wrote it all down, because Harold's legacy wasn't his savings account or his house. It was in the quiet, the forgotten, the small things, and now it was mine to keep alive. A few days later, I got a letter in the mail from Ethan. It was handwritten. Short. "Aunt Ellie, I'm sorry for everything. Mom won't say it, but I will. We got greedy. You didn't deserve what we did. I hope one day I can be someone Harold would have been proud of. Thank you for standing up for him, even when we tried to bury the truth. Ethan." I didn't cry, but I sat in silence for a long time, the letter trembling just slightly in my hands. I didn't know if I would write him back. Maybe, maybe not. Some wounds don't need words. They just need time and distance. But that letter told me something. They had learned, even if only a little, even if only for now. Later that week, I met with a lawyer to set up my will. It was the first thing I did after all the paperwork for Harold's estate was finalized. I sat there firm in my chair and spelled everything out with clarity. No loopholes, no room for vultures. I named people who showed up when it was hard, not just when there was something to take. I gave Harold's recliner to Lyle Benson, along with his book collection. I set aside a fund for the local hospice in Harold's name. And the house? That would go to a family in need, someone trying to start over. Not to blood, to character. Because I learned something in all of this. Blood can betray you. But character? That's what holds the weight of love. As I walked out of the law office, I passed a mirror in the hallway. I paused, looked at my reflection. My hair was thinner, my back curved slightly. And yes, my hands still shook. But my eyes, they didn't. They were steady, fierce, clear. And I realized something. All my life I had been underestimated, dismissed because I didn't shout, overlooked because I didn't fight loud. But when it counted, I didn't need to scream. I just needed to stand. And when I did, the truth spoke for me. So let them mock, let them laugh, let them point at trembling fingers and whisper from the corners. Because when the moment came, I handed the judge the truth, and the truth, it didn't tremble. It roared.